Greetings. Welcome back to the channel Humanity, Facts and Mysteries. We usually assume that once people begin living together in large numbers, hierarchy becomes inevitable. Leaders emerge, authority concentrates, and power takes visible form. Kings, councils, priests, or rulers appear as a natural response to complexity. This assumption feels so obvious that we rarely question it, but history does not fully support it. Long before states, before empires, before written constitutions, humanity experimented with another way of organizing life, a way that did not rely on rulers, dynasties, or centralized authority. This was not an accident, and it was not primitive chaos. It was a working system, sustained for generations. This was the first time humanity tried to live together without formal power. The archaeological record shows that some of the earliest large settlements did not develop kingship, palaces, or ruling elites. Instead of monumental centers of authority, they reveal repetition, balance, and standardization. Houses are similar in size. Burials show limited inequality. Public spaces lack clear signs of centralized control. One of the clearest examples comes from Neolithic settlements in Anatolia and the Near East, where communities numbering in the thousands lived together for centuries. These were not temporary camps. They were stable, long-lasting societies with shared rituals, economic coordination, and social continuity. What is striking is not what we find, but what we do not. There are no palaces, no royal tombs, no symbols of permanent authority. Daily life was organized around households rather than institutions. Production, food, preparation, craftwork, and ritual were embedded in domestic space. Authority, if it existed, was situational and temporary. Knowledge mattered, experience mattered, reputation mattered, but power did not crystallize into offices or titles. This challenges one of our deepest assumptions. It suggests that hierarchy is not a starting point of civilization, but a later solution to growing scale and complexity. Early large communities relied on shared norms rather than commands. Social control came from proximity, memory, and mutual dependence. When everyone lived close together, behavior was visible. Deviance carried social costs without the need for enforcement structures. Conflict existed, but it was limited. There is little evidence of organized warfare in these early settlements. No fortifications, no mass graves from battle. Violence appears interpersonal rather than institutional. This does not mean life was peaceful, but it suggests that coercion was not systematized. Religion did not create hierarchy either. Ritual spaces were integrated into everyday life rather than separated into temples controlled by elites. Belief reinforced community identity, not centralized authority. Sacred symbols were shared, not monopolized. Gender roles, where evidence allows interpretation, appear relatively balanced. Diet, workload, and burial treatment show limited differentiation. While caution is necessary, the data does not support rigid stratification. These societies function through cooperation rather than dominance. Economically, these communities were connected. Long-distance trade existed. Materials traveled across regions, yet wealth did not concentrate dramatically. Exchange served stability rather than accumulation. This prevented the emergence of economic elites who could convert resources into power. So why did this model exist? Because at a certain scale it worked. These early societies were large enough to require coordination, but small enough to maintain social transparency. Everyone knew everyone, or knew someone who did. Authority remained fluid. Decision-making likely occurred through consensus, negotiation, and tradition rather than command. But this balance was fragile. As populations grew, as trade networks expanded, and as environments changed, the limits of this system became apparent. Larger territories required delegation. Delegation required permanence. Permanence created offices. Offices accumulated power. Hierarchy did not appear because it was inevitable. It appeared because conditions changed. This is where the first experiment began to fade. Not in collapse, not in conquest, but in transformation. The early model did not fail in the way empires fail. It was slowly replaced by something more scalable, something that could project authority across distance and time. Kingship, bureaucracy, and law emerged not as moral progress, but as practical tools. Yet, the earlier system mattered. It proved that large-scale cooperation without centralized authority was possible. It showed that complexity does not automatically produce domination. It revealed that humanity's first solutions were not based on control, but on balance. And this raises an uncomfortable question. If humanity once lived together without rulers, why do we assume that hierarchy is the only possible outcome of civilization? That question would not disappear. It would return again and again, in different forms, across history. And the first attempt would not be the last. The memory of that first experiment did not vanish completely. It remained embedded in how later societies formed, even as hierarchy became more visible. Early states did not emerge from nothing. They absorbed, reshaped, and often constrained older communal structures rather than replacing them overnight. Councils, assemblies, shared rituals, and collective labor survived inside early kingdoms as echoes of an earlier balance. What changed was scale. As settlements expanded beyond what personal memory could hold, trust could no longer rely solely on familiarity. When people no longer knew each other directly, systems were needed to replace recognition. Authority became formal, rules were written, roles hardened. What had once been flexible became fixed. Hierarchy was not a revelation, it was a compromise. Kingship, bureaucracy, and law solved problems that egalitarian communities could not manage indefinitely. They coordinated distant regions, organized large armies, enforced obligations, and stored surplus. These systems worked, but they came with costs. Inequality increased. Power accumulated. Decisions moved away from everyday life into institutions that no longer required consensus. The first model did not disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it could not scale without changing its nature. Yet traces of it continued to surface across history. In village councils, in communal land systems, in assemblies that limited rulers, and in traditions that resisted absolute authority. Again and again, societies tried to recover fragments of that earlier balance, usually after centralized power failed them. This is why the first attempt matters. It tells us that human organization did not begin with domination, it began with cooperation. Control was not the foundation of civilization, but an adaptation to growth. And while hierarchy became the dominant solution, it was not the only one humanity ever tested. The earliest large communities showed that order can emerge without command, that stability can exist without permanent rulers, and that social systems can function through shared responsibility rather than enforced obedience. They did not create a perfect world, but they created a possible one. And once something is possible, it can never be completely erased from memory. History still holds many secrets, and this was only one of them. What other first attempts of humanity should we look at next? Write your thoughts in the comments. Stay with humanity, facts and mysteries. Because the world we live in is not the only one that ever worked, it is simply the one that remained.